this is the last installment of the integument. So we're going to finish up the integument. This is integument part 3. We're going to finish up the rest of the epidermis and then do some, go over the dermis itself, go over the different layers, and then we'll finish up with some aspects of the skin, functions of the integument. All right, functions, and then we'll do some wound healing, and that will finish out the integumentary system, the integument itself. And this will be the last lecture that is included on your exam on 9/18. So, excuse me. We left off talking about the epidermis, talking about some skin coloring in the last lecture. Here, I'm going to talk about some skin markings. Some different skin markings that you may be familiar with already, but giving you more of a kind of anatomical background of those markings. So you are familiar with moles, right? Those are also called the nevus, right? And this is a harmless localized overgrowth of melanocytes. Melanocytes are cells that are found in the epidermis that are important for skin color, right? And they produce that skin pigment called melanin, all right? Rarely do these moles become malignant, and we'll talk about that a little bit, right? So, but there is at some points, in some cases, they do become malignant, and a dermatologist will continually check moles, right, body, skin markings for changes. And there's a thing called an ABCD rule, okay, for skin, check for skin cancer. A stands for the appearance. Okay, what does it look like? Is it dark, right? Right, really, is it asymmetrical? Right, real. So actually, A stands for asymmetrical. Does the mole, have symmetry? If it's a circle, that's not a problem. But when it ends up being this kind of funky looking thing that you see there in red, that ends up causing problem. That should be a red flag. B should be border. B stands for border. Is the border even? Okay, so in this circle, okay, is the border even? Even if it's not a circle, right, the border's even. But now if I end up the border kind of looks like this, frayed, then that should again raise a red flag. C stands for color. Okay, moles can be purplish, they could be dark brown, they could be kind of red, even dark brown to black. The key about color is that, you want it to be uniform in color. It should be all dark brown. It should be all red. You don't want it to be red, mostly red with parts of dark brown. That should raise a red flag. And finally, D stands for diameter. Right? Is it less than 10 millimeters? Right? If it's less than a centimeter, you want to check to see if the diameter of the mole is increasing. If it's increasing, that raises a red flag. So that ABCD rule is important for early diagnosis of moles for potential skin cancer problems. Other less serious skin colorings include freckles, which are yellowish and brown spots, and they usually are representative of local areas of increased melanocyte activity, so that's usually associated with increased sun exposure. My daughter is a red-haired, fair-skinned little girl, and in the summertime, her freckles pop out like crazy around her, where her cheeks are and on her nose, based upon sun exposure. Okay, some other kind of more serious, more intense, I wouldn't say they're more serious, but more intense skin markings include hemangiomas. All right, so this is hemangioma. Hemo stands for blood, right? So this has to do with blood vessels. All right, so it's not melanocytes, but it actually has a skin coloration due to a blood. In some cases, has to do with blood vessel. In some cases, it is a tumor, right? A benign, non-malignant tumor of blood vessels. So that's increased growth of blood vessels at the skin. At the skin surface. So a couple categories. You have capillary hemangiomas, which are bright red and deep purple nodules, right? And these are your strawberry colored birthmarks. Probably less. They usually disappear at childhood. And the more permanent ones are the cavernous hemangiomas. These are larger dermal blood vessels that may last a lifetime, and there might be some of them include the port wine stains. And over here, what I gave you in the picture on the bottom right is an example of an infant who has a port wine stain. And you can see how deep, dark colored that blood vessels are at the surface of the skin. Other markings of the epidermis include friction ridges, and these are conical pegs in thin skin. They complex arches on the whorls of the fingers, the palms, the soles, and the toes. Think about this. These friction ridges are responsible for your fingerprints. Okay, but they are associated with folds of the dermis and the epidermis. Okay, and the point of your fingerprints or that ridges is to increase friction on contact. Okay, and obviously with personal identification for fingerprints. So here's what some of them look like, right? Fingerprints, you have the arch. I'll do it in green. You have an arch that looks like that, right? You have a whorl, and it kind of comes around. You have a loop, right? And then a combination here, you can kind of see this, a whorl that starts and then ends in an arch type thing, right? But each of us, the epidermis and the dermis come together, and they form these friction ridges on our fingerprints or our fingers across our whole skin, but obviously more dense and more compact in the fingers. Okay, so as we move from the epidermis to the dermis is deep to the epidermis, right? We know that we talked about connective tissue. We find much connective tissue in the dermis. The dermis includes collagen with elastic and reticular fibers, right? Elastic fibers are important for stretch and resiliency, and most of the time the dermis is this is the irregular, dense connective tissue, right, which allows stretch in multiple directions. Okay, it includes, you'll find all of the structures of the skin in the dermis: blood vessels, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, hair follicles, nail roots, sensory nerve endings, and muscles, including the erector pili muscles. There are two layers of the dermis, right? The papillary layer, which is the superficial layer, and represents about 20% of the thickness of the dermis, while the deep reticular layer is about 80% of the thickness of the dermis. All right, so we've seen this structure before, this picture. We have the epidermis, okay, up here, the epidermis, the layers of the epidermis, and then you have the two layers of the dermis, the papillary and the reticular layer. The papillary layer is up most superficial and includes this wave of the dermis, which extends up. That's called the dermal papillae. right? So you see this wave. There's where we disconnect the epidermis from the dermis. You can see these little bumps. That's the dermal papillae. Okay. Other things that you see in the dermis, we have sweat glands, right? So we have an eccrine sweat gland right here. We have an erector pili muscle, which erector pili muscles are associated with each hair follicle. They contract and stand hair up, which kind of makes it stand up and gives you your kind of goosebumps. You have sebaceous glands, one associated with each follicle. Those are oil glands. They produce something called sebum, which then lubricates and protects the skin. And then we have a number of sensory tissues, right? We have sensory vesicles. We have a root hair plexus. We have Pacinian corpuscle, right, or a lamellar corpuscle. There's a couple other ones that are present near free nerve endings that end up in the epidermis as well. And then below the dermis, we have the subcutaneous tissue, right, which is mainly the hypodermis, which is mainly adipose tissue, and it's technically not part of the skin. All right, so the papillary layer, we said the superficial region is deep to the epidermis. It is made of areolar connective tissue that is a loose connective tissue. All right, that's what the papillary is made of. And then deeper skin, we have the dermis is actually made up of dense irregular connective tissue. All right, so the name for the projection of the dermis, the dermal papillae, and they give you your epidermal ridges. These are important, the papillary layer, especially for interlocking with the epidermis, which allows, keeps those contact between those layers and keeps the epidermis actually attached to the dermis. The reticular layer, like I said, represents about 80% of the thickness of the dermis. That's the major, deeper portion. Dense irregular connective tissue, and has large bundles of collagen fibers, and those fibers form a meshwork surrounding structures which are present in there. Okay, so here's another picture from your textbook. Papillary layer, reticular layer. Reticular layer is mainly dense irregular connective tissue. Here's the dermis. Here's your little extensions, your dermal papillae, and you have a number of different structures in the dermis. You have hair follicles, sweat glands, erector pili muscles. Here's a sebaceous gland. This is a tactile or sensory receptor. You have some other ones up here. These are Meissner's corpuscles, which are sensory receptors for light touch. Numerous blood vessels, and then underneath in the subcutaneous layer, which in the hypodermis is technically not part of the skin, you have the adipose tissue. Oops. Now, what's interesting, so we talk about the dermis having this dense irregular connective tissue. They still have some type of pattern throughout the body, and this is what we call lines of cleavage. So you have a collagen elastic fibers that are arranged in parallel bundles in certain areas. So although it has this kind of irregular structure, there's also a little bit of structure in that they are arranged in parallel lines. Okay, and this happens in certain areas, and you can apply stress during routine movement, and it causes there's a orientation which actually gives you what is called your lines of cleavage or tension lines. This is important consideration for surgery for where incisions are made and how to suture incisions or cuts based upon how these collagen fibers are going to heal. So let's talk about kind of lines of cleavage. These fibers contribute to skin characteristics, right? Tensile strength, right? And then you end up with some skin stretching. So the skins stretch in certain areas, and if they're stretched beyond, you end up with the tearing of collagen fibers, and you end up with stretch marks, or called striae. Okay, so let's see what it looks like. So here's the lines of cleavage. Okay, and you can see kind of these lines are showing you their direction of how the collagen fibers in that area are aligned. Okay, so showing your top picture here, so in the blue lines are showing you that the collagen fibers are arranged in a certain parallel pattern. If you create an incision that cuts multiple lines, right, then they're not going to heal this. The collagen fibers are going to want to stay along this pattern, so that this type of incision, right, will delay healing and may cause scarring. Whereas this one, which is within a single line, and then the line of cleavage can heal along that collagen line, might be much faster. Also, when you stretch these lines out, right? So if you increase in size, right, and you stretch lines out this way, you put tension on the fibers in between, okay, and then you can cause the stretch marks or the striae that occur. Flexure lines, right? So based upon movement, these lines, lines of the palm, they are there based upon movement of your hands and your body, right? So you have flexure lines in your elbows, in the back of your knee, in your ankles, in your face, etc. Right? So movement of bones, movement of skin, you end up with these flexure lines, right, where movement and bending and stretching of skin occurs. So that covers the dermis. We're gonna come back. We'll talk about the structures of the dermis in a little bit, but I just want to touch on the subcutaneous layer, which is technically the hypodermis, is not part of the integument itself. Okay, it's composed of areolar and mostly adipose connective tissue, right? And this includes your subcutaneous fat, right? And subcutaneous fat is different depending upon the individual. It's different depending upon age. It's different depending upon gender, etc. So the point of the subcutaneous layer of the skin is to protect, cushion, and protect the body, right? It also acts as an energy reservoir, right? So you burn fat. Fat causes energy, which through cellular metabolism produces ATP. And likewise provides thermal insulation, right? Just like whales have and other marine mammals have layers of blubber, which is just fat, adipose tissue, to protect them based upon their body temperature, provide insulation, so do we. This is the subcutaneous layer. Right. Important modification or important differences of the subcutaneous, important function of the subcu layer, right, is it's this drug injection site. There's a huge vascular network that's present in there, and it promotes absorption. So you may get a subcutaneous delivery of certain treatments or drugs or pharmaceuticals that are directly into the skin, which promote absorption. So you might have delayed absorption if it's taken orally, but if it's injected under the skin, the absorption changes depending upon administration. All right, and I already mentioned that genders have different layer thickness and distribution of the subcu layer. Subcu fat is thicker in women. It accumulates primarily breast, buttocks, hips, and thighs, and it's thinner in men, but it accumulates primarily in neck, upper arms, abdomen, lower back, and buttocks, right? So it kind of like how men and women carry their body weight, their fat is different. It's different depending upon gender. All right, so here's the layers of the integument from your book. Kind of breaks everything down. You have the epidermis, the 5 layers of the epidermis itself: corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basal. Lucidum is only present in thick skin, right? And then in the dermis, you have the papillary and the reticular layer. They're not showing you all of the reticular layer here. They're just showing you the difference between papillary and reticular so you can see it. And then you have the sub-Q layer, which has no specific layers and just mainly fat. It's technically not considered part of the integument. Right? That's, I think, a really good summary table of the different layers of the skin. So the functions, all right, we're going to go through the function of the integument. Obviously, I think the most easily understood function is protection. Protects you from the outside, protects you from a number of different things, right? Chemicals, UV radiation, temperature, etc. It also, in a way, protects you against water loss or gain, right? So it prevents that. It's going to provide an outside barrier and keep water in. A metabolic regulation, vitamin D3. So the skin is necessary for activation of vitamin D, right? So when you go outside and you have UV exposure, exposure, that activates vitamin D, which is important for bone growth and a number of other functions in the body. We'll talk about secretion and absorption, right? Some things that are secreted. We have, sweat, sebum are secreted. Also, a number of electrolytes in sweat are secreted as well. The skin has a huge immune function. Many immune cells live in the dermis of the skin and provide help protect that barrier or reinforce the barrier that the skin provides. Temperature regulation, right? So we'll talk about vasodilation and vasoconstriction, which will move blood from tiny vessels in the skin, either move it to or away, depending upon whether we have to conserve or dissipate heat. And huge one is sensory reception, right? So feeling of temperature, obviously our sense of feel, the tactile reception, being able to determine light touch versus deep touch. What does a paintbrush bristles feel like as opposed to the wood of a baseball bat? Not getting hit with it, just in general. All right, so let's get to secretion and absorption. Waste products are secreted onto the skin surface during sweating, right? So we have urea, salt, and water are all parts of sweat. And this amount is adjustable. So sweat is mainly water, maybe up to 99% water. But depending upon the structure, the status of the body, it can change, right? We can increase the amount of salt based upon the hydration status of the individual. All right, that can change. So you have a number of different things that can alter. Increase urea, increase salt concentration based upon hydration status, based upon the electrolytes that are present, etc. All right, so, and this plays a role in electrolyte homeostasis, right? So we can, if we want to, for instance, if I want to conserve chlorine ions, right? Chlorine, which is mainly NaCl, right? If I want to conserve this ion, then I'm going to actually then reduce the amount of salt in sweat, and then that chlorine will be conserved for the body. All right. Another secretion that's produced is sebum from sebaceous glands found in the dermis. This lubricates the skin surface and hair, right? And this is important. It helps make the integument water resistant. That lipid, that kind of oily secretion allows for water resistance. So that water is, we have a barrier between in and out, and water stays in the body and also stays out. The skin absorbs certain chemicals and drugs, right? And so you can deliver material through the skin. You can deliver hormones, pharmaceuticals. You can actually have a long-term delivery of drugs to the body, All right, and this is called transdermal administration. Right, in the example, you might, right, there's the patch, right, it's kind of like the nicoderm patch, the nicotine patch, which is delivered to the body. One other big one that is present is birth control hormones. Right, you may have a patch that a woman puts on her body that will deliver hormones and help prevent birth. Will help control. All right, so the skin can absorb certain chemicals, but others are blocked. Gives you your selective permeability. That should be familiar to you. And then here's your transdermal administration. Some oil-soluble drugs. Right, so that oil-soluble or lipid-soluble, that's hormones. Right, like estrogen and progesterone. Those are just abbreviations for them. But they slowly penetrate the epidermis and they're involved. So this is kind of a long-term delivery. Okay, long-term delivery. Immune function. I said that the skin has an immune function, and it's basically not an immune function of the skin itself, but really the cells that inhabit the skin layers, right? So we have dendritic cells that are found in the epidermal, or the stratum spinosum of the epidermis, right? They initiate an immune response against pathogens and then attack cancer cells. So these are dendritic cells that are present there. Then that's just an example. You have mast cells and macrophages that live in the dermis of the skin, they're just sentinels. They're gatekeepers, and they're looking for any potential pathogens that arise, and they can attack them right away before more serious damage occurs. And then another large, important function of the skin is temperature regulation, and this has to do with influence of capillaries and sweat glands in the dermis. Right, so not only we're going to talk about the movement of blood in a second, but sweat glands are going to produce sweat, which will allow for water to cover the skin, right? Which water will absorb a lot of heat from the body and then transfer it to the environment. But so not only the sweat glands play a role in this, but the dermal blood vessels of the body play a role in this as well. All right. So temperature regulations, we have two different processes that happen with blood vessels. First, we have vasoconstriction. Right, constriction means to narrow. Right, so we're going to constrict in this case, the blood vessel diameter is going to go from a relatively large diameter. It's going to get smaller. And as it gets smaller, the smaller diameter, the less blood that flows through that. And so the vessel constricts, closes off. It's analogous to kind of kinking the hose. You kind of bend the hose, a garden hose, in half and shut it off, right? You kink the hose and it prevents water from going through. Well, you're going to, in this case, reduce the diameter of the blood vessel and prevents blood from going through. So less blood passage through this, right? This is a way of shunting blood away from the periphery of the body, from the skin, and pushing it somewhere else, okay? And this occurs when the body's trying to conserve heat, right? So vasoconstriction from the skin vessels occurs, and then you can't push blood out there because the diameter is less. So where does the blood go? It goes to the core organs and helps to conserve heat to the body. This is the reason why we look pale when we're cold, right? Because blood is moving away from the surface to the deeper parts of the body. Okay. Opposite to that is vasodilation. All right. In this case, you go from a small diameter vessel to a larger diameter vessel. Right. That increases flow of blood. That means more blood can go. This happens in the skin. Means more blood can go to the skin, and allows for heat to move from the body to the environment. So this is why we're results your kind of reddish pinkish face, flush face when you during exercise. So you go to exercise, at the end of exercise you have rosy cheeks, you kind of maybe you're sweating a little bit, etc., etc. Okay, but that is a very important function of the integument temperature regulation. And then finally, sensory reception, right? Skin has extensive innervation, a number of nerve fibers throughout, and this monitors your stimuli in the dermis and the epidermis, and allows you to sense certain stimulus and detect stimuli, send the input to the brain depending upon the type of where that stimulus is coming from. You can determine the type of touch. Is it a deep pressure touch? Is it a more light sensitive touch? Is it warm out? Is it cold out? What does it kind of feel? Does it feel, all of that stimuli are interpreted then took by the brain, and then an effector or appropriate response is determined. So those are the functions of the integumentary system in general. So some that are more important and more intuitive, more easily understood than others. All right, let's talk now about the derivatives of the epidermis. All right, so the epidermis, when we talk about derivatives, we're actually talking about structures that derive from epidermal cells. So if we talk about nails and hair, they're actually cells that are keratinized. They are like squamous epithelial cells that have been altered in such a way they have different types of keratin, different types of protein and structure, and then they have, they look like fingernails and hair, right? And even exocrine glands, those are all derived from epidermal cells, right? And when I talk about exocrine glands, I'm talking about sweat glands, etc. Okay, so this happens when, for example, the extra portions of the epidermis actually invaginated. So if the epidermis began on the outside of the body, right, at some point a portion of it invaginated in and eventually became separate, right? Or even like let's say, even kind of a sweat gland ended up being something like this. Let's say it's coiled like that, and then you have the duct that goes out to the outside. All right, so invagination, go from there. Hair and nails are actually composed of dead cells, and the exocrine glands are composed of limbs. All right, so let's talk about exocrine glands. Two most common types are sweat glands. They produce sweat, and sebaceous glands produce sebum. All right. So sweat glands also are called sudoriferous glands, and you have two main types of sweat glands. You have eccrine or merocrine sweat glands, which are kind of are found everywhere, right, on the skin. They're forehead, arms, legs, chest, you name it, right? And then you have apocrine sweat glands, which are found in some distinct areas. We have the axillary region, armpits, and the pubic region, right, and by the genitals. And these, all right, so the eccrine sweat glands are active from early on. Maybe infants don't sweat, but once they become able to, those are active. Those are the active sweat glands. But the apocrine sweat glands, they are only active at puberty, okay? And they produce, apocrine sweat glands produce a different kind of sweat. Not a different kind of sweat, but the sweat has a different consistency. It actually includes a kind of a lipid lipid byproduct that is present in the sweat from the apricot sweat glands. Sweat glands contain what's called myoepithelial cells. Myo means muscle. Okay, so an epithelial cell that actually has some contractive ability. So the epithelial cell can contract, and when it contracts, the nervous system stimulates this myoepithelial cell. It contracts and forces sweat into the ducts and out of the body, or onto the surface of the body. All right, so your American sweat glands are most numerous: palms, soles, forehead, the ducts, nectar, pores. Big function in thermal regulation. They're regulated by the sympathetic nervous system. This is your fight or flight nervous system. This includes, this is the ones that are activated by exercise. Okay, they secrete sweat, right, which is 99% water. There's some salts, some antibodies, some dermicidin, which is a antimicrobial protein, metabolic waste. This is kind of the sweat glands that you think of, right? Merocrine or eccrine sweat glands. The others are apricot sweat glands. All right, so here's just a picture of showing you the coiled tube that is an eccrine sweat gland. And imagine you have this tube that's kind of, if you think you take a garden hose and you kind of ball it up into this knot, and then you kind of somehow take a knife and cut through that big knot, that three-dimensional knot. That's the same thing you're looking at right here in this photomicrograph. Cutting through the knot, you're going to have pieces where you have just the hose, or you're going to part of the tube. It's going to look kind of funky. That's what the photomicrograph is showing you right here. But you're seeing epithelial cells along the tube, right? And this would be the duct. Right, here's the tube, and it would come around like this, kind of out, and there's another piece of the duct, etc. And it's kind of coiled all around from there. The apricot sweat glands, axillary and the anogenital regions of the body, right? They have sweat and fatty substances, and even some proteins, but the difference, that fatty substance, it has a viscous, a milky or yellowish tinge to it. Okay, so it's a little bit different than the sweat that's produced by eccrine sweat glands. Now, a lot of times odor is associated with underarm odor, right? Body odor is associated with underarms or the pubic region. And these sweat glands don't become active until puberty. And when does body odor become a problem, or become problematic or observed? It is at puberty. Okay. In this case, the apricot sweat glands do not terminate. They don't end on the surface of the skin. They empty into hair follicles. Okay, and then that hair is produced from there. One interesting note is a modified apricot glands include ceruminous glands, which line the ear. And these are your earwax glands, right? So the glands that produce earwax in your ear, which are meant to prevent like objects and dust and etc. going in your ear, are modified sweat glands. Also, another modification of sweat glands are mammary glands, right? When those are modified during pregnancy. Sebaceous glands produce sebum. They're widely distributed in the body. They're not in the thick skin of the palms and the soles of the feet. That's because there's no hair follicles there. All right, most develop from hair follicles and secrete the sebum into the hair follicles. They're relatively inactive until puberty. They're stimulated by hormones, especially androgens, and that's why middle school boys smell bad. Not only is the sweat being activated, but now the sebum's being activated, and they produce this oily secretion, right? Holocrine is just how those secretion is produced, but sebum works to lubricate and protect the skin. It's a bactericidal. It's an antibacterial, and helps kill the bacteria that's present on the skin surface. Okay, so here's the sebaceous gland. So here's the duct of the hair follicle, right? And we have this sebaceous gland here. And so now the duct of the sebaceous gland is right there. So this cell secrete sebum, which then is emptied in there and then released onto the surface of the hair follicle. And right here's your sebaceous gland, right? Another one right there, etc. Right, so they're associated with each hair follicle. All right, so there's the structures of the epidermis, kind of the derivatives that you need to know. The last thing we need to go through in this chapter is how does the skin repair itself? Okay, so we have this barrier that helps protect us from the outside, keep the things we want in our body in, and keep the things we want out. Okay, how does it protect itself? Because at some points that barrier is going to be damaged, right? If you're living your life, running around as a kid, you're going to fall and scrape your legs, right? Scrape your skin. You're going to break that barrier. So it's important to have a way of that damage being healed and then regenerating that barrier. So tissue is repaired in one of two ways: regeneration or fibrosis. Right? So regeneration is you replace the damaged or dead cells with the same type of cell, and you restore original function of that damaged area. Okay. The second type is fibrosis. This is commonly called scarring, right? The gap or the damage is filled with scar tissue. Scar tissue is collagen produced by fibroblasts, and the important difference is that the functional activities are not necessarily restored. So you have a scar, and scar tissue, it is not as flexible as the original skin would be. Okay, and it's not gonna have the same blood vessel vasculature. It's not going to produce the same sweat. The sweat gland is going to be altered, etc. So the function is not going to be 100% restored. So there are 4 stages of wound healing. Okay, I'll show you. They're kind of written here. Here's 1. This is 2, 3, and 4. Okay, number 1, you have a cut. Okay, so cut a the blood vessels are broken, it bleeds into the wound. All right, when it bleeds into the wound, a clot forms. Okay, so the clot forms as a temporary barrier to prevent pathogens from coming in and prevent loss of blood. Okay, so that's the second step, is the formation of a clot. Now, when the clot that forms will stimulate the beginning of tissue regeneration, right? So you'll have blood vessels start to regrow. So we have to regrow those blood vessels and reconnect them so that we have normal blood flow to the right area. So vessels regrow, and it forms a vascular connective tissue. Initially forms in the wound, and then finally the epithelium regenerates over it, and if necessary, connective tissue scarring occurs. Let's see what that looks like in a right. So, first, before wound healing, dependent on the extent of injury, and it also depends on where in the body things are needed. Obviously, longer time is needed for wider and deeper surfaces, depending upon the size and severity of the damage. More severe the damage, more severe the cut, the more likely that fibrosis will occur. Okay, so here's the stages. All right, so number 1, blood vessels bleed into the wound. Okay, you get a cut, you damage the epidermis and the dermis, and blood vessels empty into the wound, clean it out. A clot forms, stops loss of blood, and also provides a barrier for pathogens from getting in. Now, white blood cells move into the area and they start to clean this stuff up. Third stage, the vessels are starting to regrow, right? And this granulation tissue starts to form. So here you see the blood vessels, fibroblasts, start to, based upon, in response to the injury, they start to produce more fibers, right? They're producing the collagen fibers. They've been stimulated to grow and kind of fill in this gap. And they fill in the gap, all right, up to a certain point, and then the epidermis regenerates underneath it, and then you have a scab on the outside and kind of this new epidermis underneath, and then that scab falls off and you have like that kind of pinkish new skin that's present underneath where the wound was, right? And there's some connective tissue fibrosis that could occur, right? So fibrosis would be formation of a scar throughout there. So the last thing I do want to talk about is one of the major damages that can happen to skin is burns. And I want to talk about burns because it's important in how we diagnose it. Now, this slide looks a little bit different than the one you're going. It's probably easier. I thought it was easier to see. So burns can be classified based upon degree, right? So burn is either a temperature, it could be a chemical burn, it could be a temperature burn, it could be a radiation burn, right? So chemical, acid, or such, that is some type of chemical goes on the body and irritates the skin and damages it in some way. You have a UV radiation burn. You have obviously exposure to sunlight or radiation, which just damages the skin. And then obviously temperature burns, which you are probably most familiar with. Heat will cause skin to be damaged. So we can classify burns based upon the severity, first, second, or third degree, and that is based on how deep the burns go. A first degree burn, damage only occurs at the epidermis. Okay, it's localized, it's not severe, right? Example is a kind of a mild sunburn. Okay, this, you have redness, some edema. That means swelling, right? So you touch your hand to a hot pan or hot plate. You can go to get something out of the microwave and the pan's too hot and you get a little redness that happens there, right? So localized redness, edema, some pain, and this can be very mild to a little more severe, right? But they're all kind of lumped into this first degree until you then move on from the epidermis, damage to the epidermis, to the dermis. Move from the epidermis to the dermis. And when this happens, the big characteristic is blisters appear. Whenever you see blisters in a burn, they immediately becomes classified as a second degree burn. Okay, so that can occur from chemicals, from temperature, or even sun. Right? The most severe burn is the third degree burn, which includes the entire thickness of the skin is involved. So epidermis and most of the dermis, if not all of the dermis, is burned, okay, or damaged. The skin in this case actually can appear this gray-white color, a cherry red, or even blackened, right? Electrical burns are typically third degree, and they will blacken the skin around it. And at this point, there's no blistering because the skin has been burned away, and the whole layer of the skin is damaged, and it's not painful, right? Because the nerve endings that are present within the dermis are destroyed. It's not swollen because the skin is damaged in such a way that it's not doing so. All right, and the major complication with this is that you've damaged the skin so much in a third degree burn that you're losing the ability, that barrier to keep water in is gone. So you end up losing water. Right. So the major to the environment, and a major aspect is dehydration. Usually, skin grafting is usually necessary. Now we also classify, I guess, estimate the severity of burns based upon what they cover, how much of the body cover. You may have heard in news reports, so and so was in a car accident and suffered burn, second degree burns over X percent of their body, right? And this is how we estimate it. And there's actually what's called the rule of nines. So the head itself represents 9% of the body. The anterior and of the body, of the chest, thoracic and abdominal cavity are each 9%. So 18% on the front, 18% on the front of the legs, and then flip it around, 18% on the back, 18% on the back. So 18 times 2, 36, plus 36 is 72, plus 18 is 90, right? Then you end up with 4.5 on each arm. That's 99, and then you end up with the 1% around the genitals. Okay. Any type of third degree burn can be considered severe. All right. So depending upon how much of the body it covers, and like so much, if you have a third degree burn of the face or the palms of the hands, it is immediately considered a severe or a critical situation. Okay, here's some examples of burns, right? So we have first degree burns. Now they could be different in different areas. So we have first degree burns along the fingertips, redness, swelling, right? Some pain. But this area right here is second degree burns because of the blistering. And then over here you have a third degree burn, right? Redness, cherry red, and even black and gray, right? So this has a third degree burn in a certain percentage of the body. Okay, how do we treat burns? Biggest one, especially third degree, manage fluid loss. Right, we have to manage fluid loss, and in third degree burns, you end up with skin grafts. Right, so we graft tissue. We take skin from one area of the body and put it over the other. Right, and basically to manage this, we've relieved the swelling, manage pain. With third degree burns, you have to debridement. You have to remove the dead tissue, right? And you have to control infection. So that covers the rest of the epidermis, and we covered epidermis. Covers the rest of the integument. We covered epidermis, the dermis, structures of the epidermis, derivatives of the epidermis, and wound healing within the integument itself.